Over the past decade, I've had the privilege of visiting more than 70 countries around the world, including every single country in Europe, with the exception of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. For the most part, my experiences across this continent that I have lived on for more than 3 years now have been overwhelmingly positive. Europe is truly home to some of the most progressive, open, and queer-affirming societies on Earth. I've made unforgettable memories, fallen in love with new cultures, and met people who have changed my life forever for all the right reasons. But unfortunately, this hasn't been the case everywhere, and as such, I believe that sharing some of my less than ideal experiences can help others in the community stay safer, avoiding certain jurisdictions, and also to exercise more discretion in where tourist money is spent, since sometimes our most powerful weapon is how and where we spend our time, money, and energy. In discussing each of these countries, I ask you to remember the queer people who were born there, cannot leave, and continue to suffer under regressive leadership and societal attitudes. They deserve our empathy and support. However toxic a nation's overall environment may be, we must never forget those working from within to create positive change. While cultures and governments can be backwards and oppressive, we can't forget the plight of our own siblings trapped in these grotesque environments. And as LGBTQ people, when we travel, it's not only with a suitcase, but with the reality that our rights and security are not guaranteed everywhere. This is why I think it's beneficial to take the time today to outline the 5 European countries that I would not visit again, and thus cannot in good faith recommend to others in the community. Now our journey today begins in Central Europe, with the country of Slovakia, not to be confused with Slovenia, which is a very different country that happens to be one of my absolute favorite places in the world. So please don't ever slander the progressive, queer-friendly, beautiful Slovenia by confusing it with Slovakia. Rant aside, the year is 2019, it's winter and I'm traveling with some friends in Slovakia. Now, the people I was traveling with knew a family in Košice, a city in the eastern half of the country and the second largest after only the capital, Bratislava. We arrived at the home of these friends of friends, and the evening was off to a great start. We had a wonderful home-cooked dinner, and the family seemed quite normal. My friends and I were, of course, very grateful for the meal and for having a nice place to stay, but soon after moving from the dinner table to the living room, things took a not-so-nice change, as politics were immediately brought up in a shockingly blunt fashion. The father asked our opinion on Trump, and when we gave a less than enthusiastic reply, the tone turned hostile, erupting into a weird anti-Western, anti-European, and specifically anti-LGBTQ triad. By then, I remember he was drinking some kind of homemade pine needle alcohol that definitely didn't help the situation, and for at least 20 minutes we sat quietly as he praised Trump and railed against, quote, LGBT ideology. And even though the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine was still years away, our Slovak host was already echoing pro-Russian talking points, insisting we visit Romania instead of Ukraine. He claimed Lviv was extremely dangerous, and we didn't argue, both out of politeness in a stranger's home, and in my case because I was only about 20 and unwilling to engage in a confrontation on his turf. I never even mentioned being gay, never brought up my politics, and ultimately we gave into the pressure, skipping Ukraine for Romania, something I still regret. We stayed in Slovakia for several more days as planned, within our strict budget, but almost every day brought some new political or religious remark, which we ignored to avoid conflict. Of course, an unpleasant encounter with a small-minded Orthodox Christian anti-queer pro-Russian bigot in eastern Slovakia is not a reason to condemn an entire country, obviously. I place little weight on isolated anecdotes, preferring to place more weight on legislation, voting patterns, and public opinion polls, which offer a far clearer and more accurate look at a country. You see, according to a 2022 World Values Survey poll, just a mere 23.03% of Slovakian respondents believe that homosexuality can be justified. And another poll from 2023 found that just 28% of those polled in the country would accept LGBTQ people having equal rights, like marriage. Furthermore, a different study from 2023 discovered that 55% of Slovak respondents thought that LGBTQ people and rights are based in an immoral and decadent ideology. These are some of the worst numbers not only in Europe, but in the world more broadly. According to Equaldex, Slovakia ranks lower than countries like Mozambique, Angola, Bangladesh, Bahrain, China, and Venezuela in terms of public opinion towards queer people. And, as one would expect, its laws are also abysmal, including, but not limited to, a total ban on queer couples adopting and trans people having to undergo sterilization before obtaining correct documentation. The list, sadly, goes on and on. Additionally, in late 2023, Slovakia elected a far-right fascist government that is fully subservient to Russia, actively works to undermine the European Union, and spends an insane amount of time and energy targeting our community in particular. For these reasons and so many others, Slovakia represents just about everything wrong with Europe, all wrapped up in one country, and it serves as a cautionary tale of what happens when blind hatred and fear runs a country instead of facts, freedom, and hope. I hope the situation changes dramatically in the future, but at present, Slovakia simply isn't worth the risk. Now, the next destination on this list of shame is the Eastern European country of Moldova. Some may remember that about a year ago, I covered the nightmare fuel of an experience my boyfriend and I had in the Chisinau airport, so I will try to make this quick for those who don't know what happened yet. But essentially, we flew to Muldova for a 1-month stay in the country's capital because we found a lovely Airbnb that only cost around $600 for a full month, which is a huge win since money was and is quite tight. But soon after landing in the airport, we were acquainted with the reason why Muldova is so seldom visited, as upon exiting border control, some police stopped us and took us to a side room similar to the one on screen, where they interrogated us and harassed us for over an hour. They looked through our bags, saw my Young Living lavender essential oil, and asked if it was poppers. Then they went through our phones and saw pictures of us together and asked if we were gay. Of course we said no and that we were just friends. At this point, like 8 police officers were standing around us in a small room, asking us random intrusive questions. They seemed confused why we were visiting Moldova, as it does not get many international visitors, and now I honestly know why. But anyway, the turning point in the conversation was incredibly cursed, as they asked why we were visiting for a 5th time, and this time, I had the idea to mention that I wanted to see monasteries, and that my dad was a Christian pastor. Then I showed the police pictures with my huge homeschool family. Yes, I am the oldest of 7 children, and after hearing about a bunch of religious BS, their entire tone changed and they let us through. So I guess they just wanted to make sure we were not gay atheist leftists? Well, turns out I am not just a gay atheist leftist, I am the gayest, most anti-theist leftist they will ever meet in their lives, so joke's on them, I guess. But hey, I'm glad my hyper-religious conservative upbringing did serve as a good cover story. I guess it's nice to see it do something other than give me trauma for once. And yes, I was taught that dinosaurs and people lived at the same time. Anyway, after convincing the border police that we were not gay, and rather good Christian men, we were let through, and our month in the country was thankfully mostly uneventful. And here's the thing, like I mentioned earlier with Slovakia, having a shitty experience or two is not a good reason to write off an entire country, at least not to me. But sadly, the laws, political environment, and public opinion polling in Moldova is also just as hostile, and now that I look back, I think we got off rather easy, all things considered. See, a poll from the Pew Research Center back in 2016 found that only 5% of Moldovan respondents supported marriage equality. And while it is unfortunate that we don't have a more recent poll on the subject, we can see a 2024 Gallup poll, where just 8% of individuals in Moldova consider their country to be a good place for gays and lesbians. When both legislation and public opinion are taken into account, Moldova ends up with just 37 points on Equaldex, which actually places it below Equatorial Guinea and tied with countries like Djibouti and Guinea-Bissau. So essentially, Moldova is not only low by European standards, but falls behind much of Africa and the Islamic world as well in terms of LGBTQ rights and acceptance. Also, it is worth noting that the Russian puppet state of Transnistria, which has de facto broken away from Moldova, has an even worse score, and is truly one of the most dangerous places in the world to be queer. In Transnistria, even expressing support or sympathy for an LGBTQ person is enough to be imprisoned. It truly does bring dishonor on the entire continent and highlights just how bad things are for our people in every area plagued by Russian influence. Perhaps one day, Moldova will both reclaim this land stolen by Russia and advance itself socially to the point where human rights are upheld and people can live safely and openly as their authentic selves. Until that day comes, however, it remains a country that my boyfriend and I will not be returning to, nor one that we can recommend others to. Unfortunately, Moldova is simply not worth the risk. The next country on this shameful list is found in the Western Balkans. In early 2023, my boyfriend and I were driving from North Macedonia to Bosnia and Herzegovina, which meant we had to pass through a stretch of Serbia. At the border, the guards immediately began asking unusually pointed questions: why we'd been in North Macedonia, how we knew each other, where we were going, and so on. My boyfriend is from Eastern Europe, and I am American. We are both quite masculine presenting, but it is also not rocket science to get the vibe that we are a couple. Seemingly, the guards thought so too. We were told to step out of the car, led into some separate small rooms, and asked to remove all of our clothing while they inspected our belongings and bodies. It felt less like a security check and more like an intimidation tactic. It was definitely one of the worst ever travel experiences and made me disassociate massively. Eventually, after over 2 hours of questioning, most of which was related to how we knew each other and if we were gay or not, we were let go. But the whole ordeal left us shaken and eager to get out of the country as quickly as possible. We had been to Serbia the year before and stayed for a month because it is very cheap and not too far from my boyfriend's home country, but that trip also had some less than pleasant experiences, so this border incident was just the cherry on top. Maybe I'll share these other stories later, but this video is already long enough. Of course, a collection of bad encounters doesn't define a whole nation, but Serbia's broader legal climate and public attitudes tell a similarly dangerous story. According to Equaldex, Serbia scores just 49 out of 100 on its equality index, lower than Mozambique, Venezuela, Botswana, and India, just for some added perspective. Public opinion towards our community in Serbia is especially abysmal. A 2022 poll from the World Values Survey found that only 10.09% of the population thought homosexuality was justifiable. And a 2023 poll indicated that just 22% of Serbian parents would accept their own LGBTQ child. These numbers are far below the global average, and does make sense of the extreme homophobia we encountered. The laws in Serbia are also severely lacking, and the country's ex-prime minister, who claims to be a lesbian, did literally nothing to further LGBTQ rights during her term. Granted, the prime minister in Serbia is less powerful than the president, but still, the extent to which anti-queerness is ingrained in Serbian society cannot be overstated. For now, Serbia remains a place where both the laws and prevailing attitudes make life unsafe and unpleasant for our people, and experiencing this firsthand on more occasions than I even outline in this video have made the country one that we now avoid at all costs. And until there is a foundational and all-encompassing societal and political shift in the country, it's not one I can recommend to others either. Except, perhaps, to those visiting specifically to support queer activists, protest, or individuals on the ground as they fight against the incomprehensible levels of hate and bigotry in this country. Moving back now to Central Europe, we arrive in a country that I imagine almost everyone expected to make an appearance today. Yes, the infamous Hungary really is just as bad, if not worse, than the media already shows. In 2018, I was visiting a collection of Christmas markets across the region with 2 close lesbian friends. We were in Budapest for a week, and it was quite late, sometime after midnight, and we were walking back to our hotel. They were holding hands and quietly being affectionate to each other, when suddenly a man yelled something at them and threw a glass bottle in their general direction. No one got hurt by the glass, and we couldn't quite catch the words, but it was clear the anger was directed at them, not me. I was single at the time. I believe this moment was the first in my life outside of family and church where I saw anti-queer violence up close. Of course, as I feel the need to say for each country today, one unsettling moment doesn't define an entire country. But when it comes to Hungary, it's not an isolated experience. It's a systematic problem, and one that is reinforced by society and government at every level. A 2022 poll from the World Values Survey found that just 17.51% of Hungarians thought homosexuality could ever be justified, and a 2019 poll from Eurobarometer saw that only 16% of respondents supported trans people being able to change their legal gender. The legislative situation is likewise just as horrendous as one would expect. Since April 14th of 2025, participating in pride events can result in imprisonment. And since July 1st, 2021, books and movies showing LGBTQ people and relationships have been banned from public spaces, classrooms, and TV stations. Additionally, since 2020, it has been literally impossible for trans people to change their legal gender, even if they have had surgery and a medical diagnosis. This is a worse situation for trans people than even what we see in countries like Iran, Indonesia, and Tajikistan. For trans people in particular, Hungary is among the worst countries on the entire planet. As a glimmer of hope, though, I will just add that in response to Orban's ban of Pride this year, more than 100,000 people from around Hungary, Europe, and the world did show up to protest and celebrate, including many European leaders. So, the fight is far from over, and the opposition candidate is polling very well, so perhaps in a few years, Hungary will be on a very different path. But until then, Hungary is simply not worth the risk, unless visiting is for the specific purpose of protesting and supporting our queer siblings who continue to fight for their future. Heading back to the Balkans now, we come to the final country in Europe that we have no interest in visiting again, for reasons you will soon know. And the country is Bulgaria. In early 2024, my boyfriend and I arrived in Bulgaria and were picked up from the airport by our Airbnb host. About halfway to our destination, it became clear to him that we were a couple. I guess just by the way we were talking and making plans, because obviously there was no PDA. But out of nowhere, he started this super odd anti-gay rant, saying something about LGBTQ not being welcome in Bulgaria, and other nasty things I blocked from my memory or simply could not understand through his thick accent. All I know is that I yelled at him to pull over on the side of the road, told my boyfriend to get out of the car, grabbed our bags, flipped him off, told him to burn in hell, and then got out my phone and frantically called Airbnb support. I explained the entire situation, and they gave us an immediate full refund, even though the date had passed when a full refund was guaranteed. So then I proceeded to book a different place last minute, and it ended up being a drama-free experience from there. But to this day, I won't ever forget the intense anger and shock I felt in that car. If we had heeded and internalized the research we had done in Bulgaria and how socially backwards and homophobic the country is, perhaps this encounter would not have been a surprise. A World Value Survey poll from 2022 found that only 4.28% of Bulgarians think homosexuality is justifiable. And a 2023 poll found that just 21% of respondents in the country support LGBTQ rights, like marriage. Ever since August 15, 2024, publicly supporting queer people and educating on LGBTQ subjects have both been criminal offenses. This law is on par with one in Russia and has been branded the Russian law. Since 2023, trans people have not been allowed to change their legal gender under any circumstances, even after having surgery and a medical diagnosis. Before 2023, trans people had been allowed to do so for over 14 years, so this regression just highlights how bad the situation in Bulgaria is for our people. I honestly could go on and on talking about the rise of a fascist pro-Russian Orthodox Christian nationalist party that is destroying Bulgarian society from the inside. Or highlight a number of violent attacks against queer people, the fact the country's state church commits the majority of time and energy it has to promoting anti-LGBTQ sentiment, and so much more that we just don't have time to cover today. But between my own personal experiences in the country, and even more importantly the objective state of it legally, politically, and socially, my boyfriend and I have Bulgaria on our boycott list. If the purpose of a visit is to support local activism or protests, then that is incredible and honorable. But beyond this, both for safety reasons and reasons of ethical spending, visiting Bulgaria is simply not worth the risk. Whether we like it or not, tourism is a form of endorsement. We should not be subsidizing places that treat us as second class, or worse, enemies, especially when so many other countries exist that actually desire our presence. As someone who has called Europe home for more than 3 years now, it does give me immense hope that this list is relatively short. Just 5 countries out of an entire continent. And that fact alone speaks to how many European nations have made incredible strides towards equality and inclusion over the years. And still, the fight is not yet over. And silence, especially in the face of oppression caused by corrupt and morally bankrupt leaders, should be seen as little more than complicity. As such, boycotting these countries is not merely an act of personal safety, but a moral act of voting with our time, energy, and resources. But now, before we end today's video, it's time for our weekly queer news story, which happens to be yet another positive legislative update from the incredible country of Czechia. On July 18th, the Czech president signed a massive reform of the country's criminal code into law that explicitly expands hate crime protections to cover sexual orientation and gender identity, meaning that when the new criminal code comes into effect on January 1st, 2026, those convicted of hate crimes against LGBTQ people will be punished in the same way as if religious or ethnically motivated hate crime had taken place. This is yet another huge win for our community in Czechia, and while the country still has a ways to go on certain issues, it is nevertheless emerging as a regional leader in queer rights. So, once again, well done to Czechia. Hopefully its neighbors like Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland will be taking notes on how to actually safeguard a successful and free European society. Thank you, friends, for watching and spending time today with me as we seek to spread the word about important topics in the community. For those interested, you are more than welcome to stay around and join our increasingly powerful kingdom here on YouTube as we fight for our future. Until next time, QK out.